April 1944. The Atlantic Ocean. Somewhere beneath the surface, in the collapsing dark of a stricken U-boat. Kapitänleutnant Werner Brandt gripped the ladder above the aft torpedo room and made a calculation. Not an emotional calculation. A tactical one. He was 31 years old. He had spent 3 years hunting Allied convoys through North Atlantic gales. Through depth charge attacks that cracked hull welds and burst eardrums. Through weeks underwater with 37 men breathing recycled air in a steel tube smaller than a tennis court. He had torpedoed 11 ships. He had watched men drown from a periscope, from a professional distance. Because that was the job. He had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class, and he wore it with the quiet confidence of a man who understood that war was mathematics, and that he had, so far, been winning his particular equation. Now the equation had changed. He was hauled from the sea onto the deck of a United States Navy destroyer, soaking, shaking. Hands that had gripped torpedoes now gripped the arm of an American sailor, who had reached down to pull him up. Werner stood on the deck of an enemy warship and knew, with absolute certainty, one thing. He was going to be executed before sunrise. He was wrong about almost everything that happened next. To understand what happened to Werner Brandt, you need to understand the world he came from. Not Germany, exactly. The world inside his head. He had been born in 1913 in a prosperous Hanover family. That had given a son to the Great War, and received a pension and a folded flag in return. He had grown up in the humiliation of Weimar, in the chaos of hyperinflation. Yet when his mother kept her savings in a pillowcase, and still they bought nothing. In the bitterness of a nation that believed it had been cheated rather than defeated. He had been 16 when the National Socialists began their rise, 20 when they consolidated power, and 26 when the war began. He was, in other words, a product of his time and place in the most complete sense possible. A man whose entire adult consciousness had been shaped by a single ideology. He was not a monster. He was something more dangerous. A true believer. And he believed, with the unquestioned confidence of a man who has never had reason to doubt, that America was weak. Not merely militarily weak, though he believed that too. Fundamentally, racially, culturally weak. Nazi propaganda on the subject had been specific and sustained for over a decade. Yes, America was a mongrel nation, the doctrine held. A rootless civilization of racial mixture that had produced no great art. No military tradition, no will to sacrifice. Its people were soft. Its soldiers would not fight. Its factories would never match the disciplined industrial might of the Reich. Werner had no particular reason to doubt any of this. He had never been to America. He had no American friends. Everything he knew about the United States had come filtered through the apparatus of a state. That controlled every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every classroom. He also knew what happened to prisoners. He had seen the Eastern Front reports. He knew how the Reich treated Soviet prisoners of war, the deliberate starvation, the exposure marches. Power expressed itself through cruelty. The victors punished. That was how war worked. Because that was the only way war could work. An American officer approached him. Werner straightened instinctively, bracing. The officer spoke, in serviceable German. "Are you injured?" Werner stared at him. The first shock was not dramatic. It rarely is, with the things that actually change us. A sailor brought Werner dry clothing. American naval fatigues, clean, without holes or patches. Werner held the fabric between his fingers for a moment longer than was necessary. He had not worn clothing without patches in 14 months. He was taken below. A medic examined him. Nothing serious, mild hypothermia, some bruising from the concussive blast. The medic worked efficiently and without conversation, cleaned a cut above Werner's left eye. This was the detail that Werner would remember years later. How the medic apologized for the iodine stinging. Apologized. To a prisoner. for iodine. Werner filed this away behind the part of his mind already constructing explanations. This was propaganda, clearly. They were performing for someone. Perhaps for the Red Cross inspectors he knew sometimes traveled with Allied ships. The performance would end. Then the food arrived. A tray, white bread, not the dense, grayish Kriegsbrot that had been standard Kriegsmarine ration since the war's 3rd year, but actual white bread. Soft, the kind Werner had not tasted since a shore leave in 1941. Real coffee. Not the chicory mixture the German Navy had been calling coffee since the blockade tightened. A piece of meat. Pork, well cooked, thick. Werner looked at the tray for a long moment. He was a precise man, trained to calculate distances, depths, and intercept trajectories. He now calculated calories. The meal in front of him represented more food than his crew had received in a full day of active combat operations. He decided the food was a trick, a display. He ate it carefully, methodically, without pleasure, watching for the moment it would be taken away. The tray was not taken away. When he finished, a sailor, young, perhaps 19, who had not looked at Werner with anything more hostile than mild curiosity, came to collect it. He noticed the coffee cup was nearly empty. He refilled it without being asked, set it back down, and walked away. No transaction, no acknowledgement of favor given, no theater, just more coffee. Werner sat with the full cup and looked at nothing for a long moment. 3 weeks later, Werner stepped off a train at Camp Shelby, Virginia. As the camp was built on 700 acres of low Virginia countryside, a single perimeter fence with guard towers. Werner looked at the fence and noted that it appeared designed more to define a boundary than to contain human beings by force. In the mess hall, the tray placed in front of him contained roast beef, sliced thick, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, a slice of apple pie. He did the calculation again. 1 meal. More than 1 day's ration for a German frontline soldier in the final months of the Africa campaign. Around him, other German prisoners were eating, some quickly, and some, Werner noticed this, were not eating at all. Were simply sitting, looking at their trays with expressions he could not immediately classify. Not hunger. Something more complicated than hunger. A man 2 seats down, a sergeant from the 21st Panzer Division who had been a prisoner for 13 months, had tears running quietly down his face into his mashed potatoes. He was not crying from sadness. Werner understood this, obscurely, without being able to say why. The word for what the sergeant was feeling was contrast, the unbearable, almost physical weight of contrast. Werner looked back at his own tray. He ate his apple pie. He had never particularly liked apple pie. He ate every bite. It wasn't the steak that broke him. It was the casualness of it. Nobody was trying to impress him. Nobody was watching. This was simply Tuesday. Over the following weeks, Werner Brandt attempted to be a rational man. He had been trained in observation. A U-boat commander's survival depended on seeing exactly what was there, without editorial distortion. Yet he now applied this training to his captivity with the same disciplined attention he had once applied to convoy routing and attack angles. What he observed did not cooperate with his existing map of the world. The train ride from Norfolk to the camp's interior had lasted 3 days. Not in a freight car. He had expected a freight car, the standard German method of moving prisoners, but in a Pullman coach with cushioned seats that folded into sleeping berths, and a dining car with white tablecloths. Through the windows, Werner pressed his face against the glass, watched Virginia pass in the August night, the lights. He had not been prepared for the lights. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the entire Reich into darkness since 1939. Even before the war, rural electrification was sparse. Oh, barely 20% of German farms had reliable electrical supply, from his train window, traveling through rural Virginia at 10 in the evening. Werner counted. Farmhouses, every window lit, street lamps burning at every crossroads, shops with illuminated signs though they were closed, factories in the distance, windows blazing along their entire length, running through the night. An unbroken constellation of electricity, stretching in every direction as far as he could see. He had been told America was in crisis, that the war had strained its resources to the breaking point. He pressed his forehead against the window glass and counted lights until his eyes hurt. At the Norfolk Naval Base. Werner stood in a processing line and watched the base around him. 4,300 acres, cranes moving continuously, loading and unloading dozens of vessels simultaneously. In a single morning, this one facility moved more tonnage than the port of Hamburg managed in a week, and Hamburg was Germany's greatest port. But it was not the scale that stopped Werner cold. It was the parking lot. Hundreds of automobiles, private vehicles, belonging to civilian dock workers reporting for the morning shift. Ordinary laborers, men in work clothes with lunchboxes, walking from their own personal cars to their shifts. In Germany, private automobile ownership was a privilege of the upper classes and party officials. The Volkswagen, the people's car, promised to the German working class since 1934, had never been delivered to more than a handful of civilians. Here, men who loaded cargo for a living drove to work. At Camp Shelby, the camp hospital was better equipped than the civilian hospital in Werner's hometown. X-ray machines, surgical suites, pharmaceutical stores that included penicillin, the miracle drug that Werner knew German soldiers were dying for lack of, effectively unavailable to the German military since 1943. Here it was administered to prisoners with minor infections, as a routine matter. The camp canteen sold cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing paper, and musical instruments, with script currency that prisoners earned from voluntary labor. Enemy prisoners, shopping, choosing, having preferences that extended beyond survival. Werner spent a long time standing in front of the canteen shelves before he bought anything. His work assignment sent him to a farm outside the camp. The farmer's name was Patterson. Yet he was a middle-aged man whose 2 sons were in the Pacific with the Marines. He had 640 acres. He needed his cabbage field weeded, and Werner and 47 other German prisoners were going to do it. Patterson met the truck, shook hands with the American guard, explained the work, said he expected efficiency but didn't want anyone injuring themselves, because injured workers were useless to him. Then he went back to his house. Werner looked around the farm, the tractor in the barn, the truck in the yard, the house with its electric lights, the workers eating lunch, farm hands, some of them black men. Their food laid out in boxes that contained more calories than the German weekly ration for industrial workers. He turned to the prisoner working next to him, a former corporal from Munich. "Is this normal?" Werner asked. "The farms we pass, are they all like this?" The corporal looked at him. "I have been here 8 months," he said. "Yes. I have been trying to find the lie. I cannot find it. Either everything I was told about America is false, or what I am seeing is an illusion. I have been looking for 2 months. It is not an illusion." December 1943. Werner Brandt had been a prisoner for 8 months. He had given up trying to find the lie. Not in a single moment. There was no single moment. It was more like the way a bone heals. Invisibly, gradually, until one day you press on the fracture point and discover it has become stronger than the surrounding structure. America is weak. Werner watched workers near Detroit, learned that the Ford Willow Run plant, a single factory built in 9 months on empty Michigan farmland, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled aircraft from 1.5 million components, manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors across 32 states. Werner had been a naval officer. He understood logistics at a cellular level. He sat with the Willow Run number for 3 days before he let himself believe it. America is divided. Werner was given access to multiple American newspapers presenting contradictory views. The New York Times and the Chicago Tribune disagreeing openly about war strategy, about Roosevelt's decisions, about the conduct of generals. He read editorials mocking the president. He listened to a radio program that featured a comedian making jokes about military leadership. In Germany, such public criticism would have meant a concentration camp. Here it was broadcast nationally, to everyone, including enemy prisoners. The democracy he had been taught to despise appeared to grow stronger from its own internal criticism, like a muscle exercised through resistance. America is decadent. Werner attended a lecture by a professor from Stanford University who had come to Camp Shelby to teach American history. The professor answered Werner's questions, including several designed to challenge. With patience and genuine intellectual interest, he engaged with Werner's objections, as if they were worth engaging. The professor was, Werner eventually realized, Jewish, a refugee from Germany who had fled the Reich in 1938. He was teaching American history to a German naval officer in a prisoner of war camp, and he was doing so without a trace of performance or resentment. Werner did not know what to do with this. Then, in December, the Christmas packages arrived. Werner would later say that this was the moment, if he had to choose a single moment. When the last load-bearing wall of his worldview collapsed, 500,000 packages, sent by American churches, civic organizations, women's groups, and community associations, to German prisoners across the United States, enemies, men who had been, within recent months, actively trying to kill American soldiers. At Camp Shelby, the local Methodist church choir arrived to perform Christmas carols. In German, phonetically learned, the words shaped by mouths that didn't understand them, but had taken the trouble to learn them anyway. One of the choir members had a son serving in Italy. How she came anyway. She stood in the cold and sang Stille Nacht to the men who were fighting against her son, and she sang it in their language, because she had taken the time to learn the words in their language, and her voice did not waver. Werner watched her and felt something he had no ready language for. He tried the framework he had. Propaganda, calculation, performance, psychological manipulation. It didn't fit. The choir was not being filmed. There were no officials present. The woman in the third row who sang slightly flat had brought homemade cookies in a tin, had pressed them into Werner's hands specifically, had said in English that she hoped he would be home soon, and had then walked back to her car in the dark. Only people absolutely certain of victory, Werner thought, could afford to be generous to their enemies. And then a harder thought, one that arrived quietly and would not leave. Only people who genuinely believed in something larger than the war itself. Major Paul Nolan, a school teacher from Ohio before his commission, showed Werner production statistics in January 1944, numbers compiled from publicly available sources. In any previous month, Werner would have called them propaganda without looking at them. He looked at them. He said nothing for a long time. "You don't believe them," Nolan said. It was not a challenge. "I don't need to believe them," Werner said in careful English. "I have seen enough." The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant. We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. Zoom out from Werner Brandt now, because his story, as remarkable as it was not unusual. It was systemic. 371,683 German prisoners of war were held in the United States between 1943 and 1946. They were distributed across 500 camps in 45 states. They arrived in numbers that stagger the imagination. 20,000 per month in 1943, 30,000 after D-Day, 60,000 per month in the final months of the war. They were not a statistical sample. They were a generation. And they were, with almost no exceptions, converted. Not through propaganda, not through coercion, not through staged performances. The International Red Cross, which inspected American POW camps monthly, and whose reports are preserved in Geneva to this day, that consistently found conditions that exceeded not merely the requirements of the Geneva Convention, but the living standards many prisoners had known as civilians. Of 371,000 prisoners, fewer than 1% attempted escape. 2,222 attempts in total from a population larger than a major city. 0 successful permanent escapes. No American civilians harmed by escaped prisoners. By war's end, post-war surveys found that 95% of German POWs in America rated their treatment as good or excellent. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs. 40,000 had enrolled in democracy education courses. And then they went home. They returned to a Germany that was rubble: Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, as the infrastructure of a civilization reduced to its foundations. 30 million displaced persons, a currency worth nothing. But 371,000 men came home carrying something the bombs could not reach: memory. They had seen how a free society organized itself. They had seen agricultural mechanization, industrial methods, democratic institutions functioning through disagreement rather than despite it. They had seen workers who owned cars, farmers who owned tractors, hospitals that treated enemies. They had watched an economy generate abundance through competition and cooperation, rather than through central command and forced labor. They knew it was possible, not as theory, as lived experience. There is a footnote to all of this that history has trouble deciding whether to call a tragedy or a love story. Georg Gartner was an Afrika Korps soldier transferred to Camp Deming, New Mexico in late 1944. He escaped in September 1945. After the war had already ended, after Germany had surrendered, after repatriation had begun, he did not flee America. He stayed in it. He changed his name, found work as a tennis instructor in California, married an American woman, and raised children in a country he had originally come to as an enemy. He lived this life for 40 years, when he finally surrendered voluntarily to a journalist working on a documentary. It was 1985. He had been American longer than he had been German. The FBI investigation found that he had broken no laws except the original illegal entry. He was granted citizenship. He had escaped a prison camp in order to stay in the country that had imprisoned him. He was not the only one. Yet in 1985, 500 former German prisoners of war returned to America. They gathered in Austin, Texas, not far from where many of them had first arrived, by train, in the summer of 1943. Faces pressed against the glass at the impossible American lights. They were old men now, in their 60s and 70s, with the careful movements of people carrying years. Some had brought their children. Some had brought grandchildren who spoke no German, and had grown up in cities that no longer bore the wounds of a war they had never seen. They visited their old camps. They placed flowers at American Legion memorials. They embraced men who had once been their guards. One of them stood at a podium in an Austin hotel ballroom and delivered remarks that a journalist in the room described as the most quietly devastating speech she had ever transcribed. He was 78 years old. He had arrived in America in 1943 as a convinced National Socialist who had served the Reich with genuine belief in its righteousness. He had torpedoed Allied ships. He had watched men drown. He had been certain, on a cold April morning in 1944, when American sailors hauled him from the Atlantic, that he was going to be executed. We came to America as enemies. We came as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We were shown something we had no language to understand, a people who were strong enough to be kind to their enemies, not because they were weak, not because they were performing, because they were absolutely certain of what they stood for, and because that certainty left no room for cruelty. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth written not in words, but in electric lights and apple pie, and a Methodist choir that learned our carols in our language. America showed us that strength comes, not from conquest, but from creation, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from fear, but from the confidence of a free people. We returned to Germany with a mission, to build a society that could create rather than destroy. To America, from your former enemies, now your oldest friends, thank you for showing us the way. What was the stake? Werner Brandt ate his first camp meal in the summer of 1944 and calculated its caloric content with the precision of a naval officer, and felt underneath that calculation something he would spend years trying to name. Not gratitude. Gratitude implies that you believed you deserved less. Not surprise. Surprise implies that you had specific expectations. Something closer to the feeling of a lens adjusting into focus, of a picture sharpening from blur into clarity. He had been told that a certain world existed. He was looking at a different world. The stake was not food. The electric lights stretching across the Virginia countryside were not infrastructure. The Christmas packages from the Methodist Women's Group were not charity. The Stanford professor who engaged his objections with genuine intellectual interest, a Jewish refugee from the country Werner had served, was not performing tolerance. They were all the same argument, an argument made not in speeches or pamphlets or the kind of propaganda Werner had grown up breathing like air, an argument made in the language of daily reality, in the accumulated weight of Tuesday afternoons and ordinary meals, and the unremarkable, persistent, absolutely radical fact of a free people living freely. And in the end, that argument won. 371,683 men came to America as the trained soldiers of a totalitarian state. They left as the seeds of a democracy. They went home and planted what they had seen in the rubble of a destroyed nation. And what grew from that rubble became, within a generation, one of the great democratic success stories of the 20th century. The trains that carried them into captivity in 1943 carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried something else. Not broken men, not humiliated men. Something rarer. And men who had seen the future, and knew, from their own hands and eyes, hunger and the apple pie on a Tuesday, and the choir singing carols in a language it didn't understand, that it worked. If this story changed the way you see history, you're not ready for what's coming next. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on your notifications, because the stories they never taught you are just getting started. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or other countries. Tell us in the comments section. Thank you for watching.